Commander Jake Morrison had seen enough death for 10 lifetimes, 23 years as a Navy SEAL, 15 combat deployments, and scars that told stories he'd never share with civilians. Now, standing on the wraparound porch of his grandfather's old ranch in Montana, he felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: complete and utter defeat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Morrison Ranch had been in his family for 4 generations. His great-grandfather had bought the land in 1923 with money earned from bootlegging during Prohibition. His grandfather had raised cattle here through the Great Depression and World War II. His father had tried to modernize the operation in the 70s and 80s, but mounting debts and falling cattle prices had slowly strangled the life out of the place. Jake had inherited the ranch 3 years ago when his father passed from cancer. At the time, he was still active duty, leading SEAL Team 6 operations in classified locations around the globe. He'd hired a property management company to keep an eye on things, thinking maybe he'd retire there someday. But every quarterly report painted the same grim picture: declining revenues, mounting repair costs, and a property that was hemorrhaging money faster than a punctured artery. The ranch sprawled across 1,200 acres of what locals called marginal land, too rocky for serious farming, too isolated for development, and too dry for consistent cattle grazing. The main house, built in 1924, was a beautiful but aging structure that needed a new roof, updated plumbing, and electrical work that would cost more than Jake's annual military salary. The barn was literally falling down on one side, held up by makeshift supports that his father had installed years ago. 3 smaller outbuildings were in various states of decay, and the fencing that bordered the property looked like it had been installed during the Eisenhower administration. What made matters worse was the isolation. The ranch sat 47 miles from the nearest town of any significance, down a dirt road that became impassable during heavy snow or spring thaws. The property management company had been polite but clear. This wasn't a viable commercial operation anymore. They recommended selling while he could still get something for the land value. Jake had resisted for 3 years, sentimentality overriding financial sense. This was Morrison land. His great-grandfather had worked these fields. His grandfather had taught him to ride horses in the lower pasture. His father had shown him how to fix engines in the old garage behind the main house. Every summer of his childhood had been spent here, learning the values that would later serve him well in the military: hard work, self-reliance, and respect for the land. But sentiment doesn't pay property taxes. It doesn't fix broken water pumps or replace rotted fence posts, and it certainly doesn't justify keeping a money pit when you're planning to retire on a military pension that, while respectable, wasn't designed to subsidize a failing ranch operation. The final straw had come 6 months ago. A severe hailstorm had damaged the roof beyond repair, and the estimate for replacement was $87,000. Jake had looked at his savings account, looked at the property management reports, and finally admitted what everyone else had known for years: the Morrison Ranch was finished. He'd contacted 3 different realtors, but their assessments had been brutally honest. The land might be worth something to a developer eventually, but the buildings were essentially worthless. One realtor had actually used the word tear down when describing the main house, which had felt like a knife to Jake's gut. Another had suggested he might get more money if he demolished everything himself and just sold vacant land. The asking price they'd settled on was $890,000, a number that seemed simultaneously too high and insultingly low. Too high because no rational person would pay nearly $1 million for what was essentially a very expensive fixer-upper in the middle of nowhere. Too low because it represented the complete dissolution of 97 years of Morrison family history. For 8 months, the ranch had sat on the market. A few potential buyers had come to look, but Jake could see the reality dawning in their eyes as they toured the property. The isolation, the repair costs, the lack of any obvious path to profitability, it all added up to a hard pass.
One couple from California had seemed interested until they realized there was no cell phone coverage and the nearest hospital was an hour and 20 minutes away. Jake had started to think he'd be stuck with the place forever, watching it slowly collapse while bleeding money he couldn't afford to lose. He'd even considered the nuclear option, walking away entirely and letting the bank foreclose. It would destroy his credit and betray everything his family had built. But at least the financial hemorrhaging would stop. That's when Sarah Chen had called.
Sarah Chen was not what Jake Morrison had expected when his realtor called to schedule a showing. Over the phone, she'd sounded professional, but vague about her intentions for the property. She'd asked specific questions about water rights, mineral rights, and the exact boundaries of the land. Questions that suggested either genuine interest or thoroughness that bordered on obsessive. When she pulled up to the ranch house in a dusty Toyota 4Runner, Jake's first impression was of competence. She wasn't dressed like the typical tire kickers who'd toured the property over the past 8 months. No designer boots or carefully coordinated ranch casual outfits. Instead, she wore practical hiking boots, jeans that had actually seen work, and a flannel shirt that looked broken in rather than bought broken in. Sarah was 42 years old, though she looked younger despite the silver threading through her black hair. She'd grown up in San Francisco as the daughter of immigrants from Taiwan, but something in her bearing reminded Jake of the career soldiers he'd served with, people who assessed situations quickly and moved with purpose. "Commander Morrison," she said, extending a firm handshake. "Thank you for meeting me personally." "Just Jake," he replied, noting that she'd done her homework on his military background. "And thanks for coming out. I know it's quite a drive." What followed was the most thorough property inspection Jake had ever witnessed. While previous potential buyers had focused on the obvious problems, the sagging barn roof, the peeling paint on the main house, the overgrown fields, Sarah seemed interested in details that most people ignored entirely. She spent 20 minutes in the basement of the main house, examining the stone foundation with a small flashlight. She asked about the original construction methods and whether any renovations had been done to the basement over the decades. She measured rooms and took notes in a leather notebook that looked well used. Outside, she walked the entire perimeter of the property, stopping frequently to examine fence posts, rock formations, and what appeared to be completely unremarkable patches of ground. She asked about the property's history, about Jake's grandfather and great-grandfather, about any stories they might have told about the early days of the ranch. "My great-grandfather was quite a character," Jake found himself saying as they stood near the old barn. "Family legend says he was involved in some pretty shady business during Prohibition. Bootlegging, mostly. He supposedly had connections with organized crime figures in Chicago and Detroit." Sarah's eyes sharpened with interest. "Did he ever mention hiding anything on the property? Cash, merchandise, anything like that?" Jake laughed. "Every old ranch has those kinds of stories. Buried treasure, hidden loot, mysterious tunnels. My grandfather used to joke that the old man had buried a fortune somewhere on the land, but we never found so much as a mason jar full of coins." "What about the buildings? Any unusual construction features? Hidden rooms, reinforced areas?" "The basement has some odd features," Jake admitted. "Thicker walls in some places, a couple of rooms that seem too small for their foundations. But the house is almost 100 years old. Building techniques were different back then." Sarah nodded thoughtfully and made more notes. She asked to see property surveys, tax records, and any family documents that might reference improvements or construction projects. Jake found himself digging through boxes of paperwork he hadn't looked at in years, trying to satisfy her seemingly endless curiosity about the ranch's history. What struck Jake most was that Sarah never once mentioned the obvious problems with the property. She didn't wince at the sagging barn roof or comment on the overgrown pastures. She didn't ask about repair estimates or express concern about the isolation. Instead, she seemed to be evaluating something entirely different, some potential that Jake couldn't identify.
After 4 hours on the property, Sarah asked if she could sit down and talk numbers. The asking price is $890,000, Jake said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs that had been his grandmother's. I'll be honest with you, I've had the place on the market for 8 months, and you're the first person who's shown this level of interest. Sarah nodded. I've done my research on comparable properties in the area. I know this isn't exactly a hot market. Then why are you interested, if you don't mind me asking? Most people take one look at the repair estimates and run the other direction. I'm not most people, she said simply. I grew up poor, Commander. My parents worked 16-hour days in a restaurant kitchen so I could go to college. I learned early that other people's mistakes can be your opportunities. I also learned that sometimes the most valuable things are hidden in plain sight. She opened her leather notebook and showed Jake pages of calculations, diagrams, and what appeared to be research notes about the property and surrounding area. I'm prepared to make an offer, she said. Full asking price, cash, closing in 30 days. Jake stared at her. In 8 months of showings, he hadn't received a single written offer, let alone one for full price. Cash? He repeated. Cash. I can have proof of funds to your realtor by tomorrow morning. Jake felt a mixture of relief and bewilderment. After months of dreading that he'd be stuck with the ranch forever, here was someone offering to solve all his problems with a single transaction. Can I ask what you plan to do with the place? She smiled, the first genuinely warm expression he'd seen from her all day. I'm going to find out if your great-grandfather's stories were true.
The closing took place on a cold October morning in the county seat, 30 miles from the ranch. Jake Morrison sat in the lawyer's office, signing document after document that would transfer ownership of the Morrison Ranch to Sarah Chen. Despite his relief at finally unloading the property, he felt a profound sense of loss as he signed away 97 years of family history. Sarah was efficient and businesslike throughout the process. Her funds had cleared exactly as promised, and her lawyer had reviewed every document with meticulous attention to detail. She asked pointed questions about mineral rights, water rights, and easements that suggested this wasn't her first major property acquisition. One last thing, Jake said as they gathered their copies of the paperwork. I know it's none of my business anymore, but I'm curious. You mentioned finding out if my great-grandfather's stories were true. What exactly are you looking for? Sarah hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Are you familiar with the history of bootlegging operations in Montana during Prohibition? Somewhat. I know there were smuggling routes through here to Canada. Your great-grandfather wasn't just involved in bootlegging, Sarah said. According to records I found, he was a key figure in a network that moved illegal alcohol from Canadian distilleries to major cities in the Midwest. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar operation by 1920s standards. She pulled out a tablet and showed Jake what appeared to be digitized newspaper clippings and court documents. Thomas Morrison was arrested twice, but never convicted. Federal agents raided properties associated with him at least 4 times between 1923 and 1929, but they never found significant evidence. That's unusual for someone at his level of the operation. So, you think he was better at hiding things than the average bootlegger? I think Thomas Morrison was exceptionally clever about asset protection. Look at this. Sarah showed Jake a photograph of a 1920s newspaper article. The headline read, "Massive Bootlegging Ring Exposed," with a subheading about federal raids recovering hundreds of thousands in cash and silver. Silver? Jake asked. Payment in silver was common for high-level bootlegging operations. It was more stable than cash, easier to transport than gold, and harder for authorities to trace than bank deposits. A successful bootlegger in the 1920s would have accumulated significant quantities of silver coins and bars. Jake studied the documents Sarah was showing him. And you think my great-grandfather buried silver on the ranch? I think Thomas Morrison was smart enough to create a secure storage location for his assets, and I think the ranch he purchased in 1923 was chosen specifically for that purpose. The timing is too perfect to be coincidental. As they walked to their cars, Sarah continued explaining her theory. She had spent months researching Prohibition-era criminal networks in Montana and had identified patterns in property purchases, arrest records, and federal raid reports that suggested several major figures had used remote ranches as storage facilities. The basement of your ranch house has some very unusual features. The foundation is over-engineered for a 1920s farmhouse. There are structural elements that suggest it was designed to support significant weight, and some of the walls are thick enough to hide substantial storage spaces. Jake found himself both impressed and slightly unsettled by the depth of Sarah's research. "How long have you been planning this?" 2 years. I started with genealogical research on bootlegging families and worked backward to identify properties that might have been used for asset storage. Your ranch checked every box on my list. "And if you're wrong, if there's nothing there," Sarah shrugged, "then I own 1,200 acres of Montana rangeland that I got for a very reasonable price. I'm not risking money I can't afford to lose." As Jake drove away from the courthouse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just made either the best decision of his life or the worst mistake. Part of him was relieved to be free of the ranch and its mounting expenses, but another part wondered if he'd just sold away a family fortune that had been sitting under his nose for decades. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen stood in the basement of the ranch house with a team of contractors and ground-penetrating radar equipment. She had spent the time since closing conducting more detailed research, including interviews with elderly locals who remembered stories about Thomas Morrison and his business associates from the Prohibition era. The basement inspection had confirmed her suspicions. Behind what appeared to be a standard foundation wall, the radar had detected a void space approximately 8 feet by 12 feet. The wall itself was nearly 3 feet thick, far beyond what would be necessary for structural support in a 1920s ranch house. "It's definitely hollow," said the contractor she had hired to break through the wall. "And there's something in there. The radar is picking up dense objects with regular shapes." Sarah felt her heart racing as they began carefully removing stones from the wall. If she was right, she was about to validate 2 years of research and hundreds of hours of investigation. If she was wrong, she was about to discover that she had spent nearly $1 million chasing a fantasy. The first hint that her theory was correct came when they broke through the outer layer of stone. Behind it was a carefully constructed wooden framework, not the random rubble fill you'd expect in a normal foundation wall, but deliberate carpentry designed to create and protect an enclosed space. And when they finally opened that space, Sarah Chen found herself looking at the vindication of everything she had believed about Thomas Morrison and his hidden fortune. The hidden chamber was a masterpiece of 1920s engineering and paranoia. Thomas Morrison had constructed what amounted to a bank vault inside his ranch house basement, using techniques that wouldn't have been out of place in a high-security facility. The walls were lined with cedar planking to prevent moisture damage, and the floor was covered with oiled canvas that had somehow remained intact after nearly a century. But it was the contents of the chamber that made Sarah Chen's breath catch in her throat. Stacked along the walls were dozens of wooden crates, each roughly the size of a case of wine. The crates bore shipping labels from various Canadian distilleries. Clearly, they had originally contained bootleg liquor. But whatever liquid they'd once held had been replaced with something far more valuable and permanent. Sarah carefully opened the first crate and found herself looking at rows of silver bars, each bearing the mark of established refineries from the 1920s. The bars were wrapped in oiled cloth and separated by wooden dividers that had kept them from shifting or touching each other during storage. "My God," whispered the contractor who'd helped break through the wall. "Is that real silver?" Sarah lifted one of the bars, feeling its substantial weight. Even in the dim light of their work lamps, the metal gleamed with the unmistakable luster of pure silver. The bar was marked with a purity stamp, .999 fine, and bore the seal of a Chicago-based refinery that had operated during the Prohibition era. As they systematically opened crates, the magnitude of Thomas Morrison's hidden treasure became clear. Each crate contained between 20 and 30 silver bars, and there were 47 crates in total. Beyond the bars, they found smaller containers holding silver coins.
Hundreds of Morgan silver dollars, peace dollars, and various denominations of silver certificates that had been redeemable for silver during the 1920s. Sarah had brought a portable scale to verify her findings, and as she weighed representative samples from different crates, her calculations became increasingly astounding. The average silver bar weighed approximately 32 troy ounces, exactly 2 pounds of pure silver. With over 1,000 bars in the chamber, they were looking at more than 32,000 troy ounces of silver. But silver prices in 2023 weren't what they had been in 1925. What Thomas Morrison had hidden as a hedge against law enforcement raids had become something far more valuable due to nearly a century of inflation and precious metals appreciation. At current market prices, 32,000 troy ounces of silver represented approximately $90 million in silver. The discovery raised immediate practical questions that Sarah hadn't fully anticipated. How do you safely transport $90 million in precious metals? How do you verify authenticity on such a large quantity of vintage silver? And perhaps most importantly, how do you convert such a discovery into liquid assets without attracting unwanted attention from criminals or triggering government investigations? Sarah's background had prepared her for complex logistical challenges, but nothing quite like this. She was a former software engineer who had made her initial fortune developing database security systems for financial institutions. She'd sold her company 5 years earlier and had been investing in real estate and conducting historical research as a way of staying intellectually engaged during early retirement. Her interest in Prohibition-era history had started as a hobby. Genealogical research into her own family's immigration story had led her to investigate the criminal networks that had helped Chinese immigrants find work in illegal enterprises during the 1920s. But what had begun as family research had evolved into a sophisticated understanding of how criminal organizations of that era had moved and hidden assets. The discovery in Thomas Morrison's basement represented the culmination of 2 years of research, but it also presented challenges she hadn't fully considered. The silver was undeniably valuable, but it was also heavy, difficult to transport, and potentially problematic from a legal standpoint. The first step was documentation. Sarah spent 3 days photographing every bar, every coin, and every piece of evidence in the hidden chamber. She cataloged serial numbers, refinery marks, dates, and any other identifying information that might be relevant for authentication or legal purposes. She also researched the legal status of her discovery. Montana law is reasonably clear. Treasure found on property you own belongs to you, provided it wasn't stolen from someone else. Given that Thomas Morrison had owned the ranch legally and there was no evidence that the silver itself had been stolen, Sarah appeared to have clear title to her discovery. The authentication process required experts, and experts meant publicity, something Sarah wanted to avoid until she better understood the implications of her discovery. She contacted a precious metals dealer in Denver who specialized in historical silver, explaining that she had inherited a collection from a relative and needed professional evaluation. The dealer, Marcus Webb, agreed to come to Montana to examine what Sarah described as a significant quantity of vintage silver bars and coins. She didn't mention the exact quantity or circumstances of the discovery, preferring to let him draw his own conclusions about the collection's origin. When Webb arrived at the ranch, his reaction to the hidden chamber was similar to Sarah's contractors: stunned disbelief, followed by professional fascination. As a dealer in precious metals, he'd seen large collections before, but nothing approaching the scope of Thomas Morrison's hidden treasure. The good news, Webb said after spending a full day examining representative samples, is that everything appears to be authentic. The refinery marks are consistent with 1920s production, the purity is exactly what you'd expect, and there are no obvious signs of forgery or tampering. And the bad news? Sarah asked. Moving this much silver is going to be complicated. We're talking about roughly 2,000 pounds of precious metal. You can't just walk into a coin shop and sell $90 million worth of silver bars. It's going to require careful planning, proper documentation, and probably multiple transactions spread over time. Webb's assessment of the logistics proved accurate. Converting Thomas Morrison's silver hoard into liquid assets was going to be a complex operation, requiring discretion, patience, and careful legal maneuvering. The sheer volume of precious metal presented problems that Sarah hadn't fully anticipated when she'd begun her treasure hunt. The first challenge was physical security. $90 million in silver bars couldn't remain in a basement chamber that had already been opened and examined by multiple people. Sarah needed secure storage, but moving the silver to a commercial facility would require documentation and insurance that might draw unwanted attention. Webb recommended a precious metals storage facility in Denver that specialized in high-value collections and offered complete discretion for clients. The facility provided armored transport, but moving 2,000 pounds of silver from rural Montana to Colorado would require multiple trips and careful coordination. The key is to treat this like any other valuable collection, Webb explained. Document everything, insure everything, and move everything through established legal channels. The worst thing you could do is try to hide the discovery or avoid proper reporting. Sarah spent 2 weeks arranging the logistics of moving the silver. The armored transport company treated the job as routine. Apparently, moving large quantities of precious metals from private residences was more common than Sarah had realized. The drivers were professional and discreet, asking no questions about the origin of the collection or the circumstances of its discovery. With the silver safely stored in Denver, Sarah began the process of authentication and valuation. Webb introduced her to other experts in vintage silver and Prohibition-era collectibles, each of whom confirmed the authenticity and historical significance of the collection. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a historian specializing in Prohibition-era criminal organizations, was particularly interested in the discovery. She explained that Thomas Morrison's collection was one of the largest intact bootlegger hoards ever found, and its historical value might actually exceed its precious metal value. Collections like this are extraordinarily rare, Dr. Hoffman explained during their meeting at the storage facility. Most bootleggers who accumulated significant assets either spent them, lost them to law enforcement, or died before they could recover them. Finding an intact hoard that's been undisturbed for nearly a century is almost unprecedented. The historical significance of the discovery opened possibilities that Sarah hadn't considered. Museums and private collectors might be willing to pay premiums for historically significant pieces. The story of Thomas Morrison and his hidden treasure could add substantial value beyond the silver's intrinsic worth. But there were also potential complications. Dr. Hoffman warned that significant archaeological or historical discoveries sometimes attracted government attention, particularly if they might have cultural or national significance. While Sarah clearly owned the silver legally, the discovery might trigger academic interest that could complicate her plans for quiet disposal. Sarah decided to proceed methodically, selling small portions of the collection while researching options for the remainder. Her first sale was a single crate of silver bars to Webb's dealership, approximately 30 bars with a total value of roughly $2 million. The transaction went smoothly, providing Sarah with immediate liquid assets while serving as a test case for larger sales. The money from that first sale allowed Sarah to quit her consulting work and focus full-time on managing her discovery. She established a limited liability company to handle the silver transactions and hired an accountant who specialized in precious metals investments to ensure proper tax reporting. Over the following months, Sarah developed relationships with multiple precious metals dealers, spreading her sales across different markets to avoid attracting attention from any single source. She sold to dealers in Denver, Phoenix, and San Francisco, sometimes selling bars individually and sometimes selling small lots of 3 or 4 bars. The process was slow but steady. Each transaction required paperwork, authentication, and patience. Sarah found herself learning about precious metals markets, tax implications of large asset sales, and the surprisingly complex world of collectible silver trading. 6 months after the initial discovery, Sarah had sold roughly a quarter of the collection for over $20 million. The money had been invested in a diversified portfolio of real estate, stocks, and bonds, converting Thomas Morrison's Prohibition-era hedge against law enforcement into a modern fortune. But the most interesting development had been the attention her discovery was attracting from academic and historical circles. Word had leaked, despite her efforts at discretion, about the Morrison silver hoard, and researchers were becoming interested in the broader story of Prohibition-era asset hiding. Dr. Hoffman had approached Sarah about writing a book about the discovery, focusing on Thomas Morrison's role in bootlegging networks and the historical significance of his hidden treasure. Other researchers wanted to study the silver bars themselves, analyzing their composition and manufacturing marks to better understand precious metals production during the 1920s. Sarah found herself in an unexpected position. She was becoming an authority on a historical topic she'd only started researching 2 years earlier. Her discovery had opened a window into an aspect of Prohibition history that had been largely lost, and academic institutions were interested in preserving and studying that history. The University of Montana offered to purchase a representative sample of the collection for their historical archives, paying premium prices for pieces that would be displayed and studied rather than melted down for their metal content. Similar offers came from the Montana Historical Society and several private museums that specialized in Western American history. These institutional seals offered advantages beyond simple monetary transactions. Museums and universities provided documentation and provenance that enhanced the value of the remaining collection. Each piece sold to a historical institution became part of an official record that authenticated the entire discovery. As Sarah approached the first anniversary of her purchase of the Morrison Ranch, she realized that her treasure hunt had evolved into something much larger than a simple real estate investment. She had uncovered not just a fortune in silver, but a piece of American history that was reshaping academic understanding of Prohibition-era criminal networks.
The transformation of Sarah Chen's life following her discovery was as dramatic as the discovery itself. Within a year of breaking through the basement wall, she had gone from a comfortable early retiree to a multimillionaire with growing influence in academic circles studying Prohibition-era history. But success brought its own challenges. As word of the Morrison silver hoard spread through academic and collector communities, Sarah found herself dealing with increasing attention that threatened the privacy she'd been trying to maintain. The first sign of unwanted interest came in the form of a phone call from a journalist at the Montana Standard, who had heard rumors about a significant historical discovery at a ranch in the county. The journalist was professional but persistent, asking questions that suggested someone had provided detailed information about Sarah's find. Sarah declined the interview, but the journalist's call served as a warning that her story was becoming public knowledge, despite her efforts at discretion. She realized she needed to get ahead of the publicity rather than trying to avoid it entirely. Working with a public relations consultant recommended by Dr. Hoffman, Sarah crafted a controlled narrative about her discovery that emphasized the historical significance while downplaying the monetary value. The story they developed focused on her research methods and the importance of preserving Prohibition-era artifacts rather than the spectacular dollar amounts involved. The controlled release of information worked better than Sarah had hoped. The story of a dedicated researcher uncovering a forgotten piece of Montana history resonated with both local and national media, but the coverage remained focused on the historical angle rather than sensationalizing the treasure aspect. Sarah appeared on several Montana radio programs and was featured in articles in Western history magazines. She spoke at historical societies and university events, sharing her research methods and encouraging others to explore local history through careful documentation and investigation. The academic attention led to unexpected opportunities. The University of Montana offered Sarah a visiting scholar position, allowing her to continue her research into Prohibition-era criminal networks while having access to university resources and graduate student researchers.
Working with university historians, Sarah began expanding her research beyond Thomas Morrison to investigate other figures in Montana's bootlegging networks. The methods she'd developed to identify potential treasure sites could be applied to other historical questions about how criminal organizations of the era had operated. Her research uncovered evidence of a sophisticated network of ranches, businesses, and individuals who had collaborated to move illegal alcohol from Canadian distilleries to markets throughout the western United States. Thomas Morrison hadn't been an isolated operator, but part of a larger organization that had left traces throughout Montana's historical records. The broader research project attracted funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and several private foundations interested in Western American history. Sarah found herself leading a team of researchers who were mapping the entire structure of Montana's Prohibition-era criminal networks. The irony wasn't lost on her. Thomas Morrison's hidden silver had not only made her wealthy, but also launched an academic career she'd never planned. Her background in database systems proved invaluable for organizing and analyzing the massive amounts of historical data the research project was generating. 2 years after the initial discovery, Sarah published her first academic paper. Asset Protection Strategies and Prohibition-era Criminal Networks, Evidence from the Morrison Collection. The paper used her silver discovery as a case study to analyze how bootleggers had protected their wealth from law enforcement seizure. The paper was well received in academic circles and led to speaking invitations at history conferences across the country. Sarah found herself becoming a recognized expert in a field she'd stumbled into accidentally, her practical experience with treasure hunting giving her insights that traditional historians lacked. But the academic success hadn't distracted her from the practical matter of managing her silver collection. By the end of her second year as owner of the Morrison Ranch, Sarah had sold approximately half of the silver bars, generating over $45 million in gross proceeds. The sales had been carefully managed to minimize tax implications and avoid market disruption. Working with precious metals dealers and tax specialists, Sarah had structured the transactions to spread the tax burden over multiple years while diversifying her investments to reduce risk. The remaining silver, still worth over $40 million, was being held for strategic sales and potential museum donations. Sarah had discovered that donating historically significant pieces to qualified institutions provided substantial tax advantages while ensuring that important artifacts would be preserved for future research. The Morrison Ranch itself had been transformed from a liability into an asset. Sarah had used part of her silver proceeds to fully renovate the property, turning it into a comfortable retreat where she could conduct research and host academic conferences on Western history. The ranch now featured a modern conference facility, updated guest accommodations, and a museum space where selections of the Morrison silver collection were permanently displayed. The property had become a destination for researchers and history enthusiasts, generating additional income while serving Sarah's academic interests. Jake Morrison had followed Sarah's story through news reports and mutual acquaintances in the area. The former SEAL commander had mixed feelings about his decision to sell the ranch, but he couldn't argue with the outcome. Sarah's discovery had vindicated her research methods while providing her with opportunities he never could have imagined. When Sarah invited Jake to visit the renovated ranch and see what she'd discovered in his family's basement, he was surprised by how different the property looked. The buildings he'd viewed as expensive liabilities had been transformed into a beautiful and functional complex that honored the ranch's history while serving contemporary purposes. Standing in the basement chamber where Thomas Morrison's silver had been hidden for nearly a century, Jake felt a complicated mixture of regret and admiration. He'd inherited a treasure and sold it without ever realizing its value. But Sarah's stewardship of both the discovery and the property had created something more valuable than money, a preserved piece of history that would benefit researchers and students for generations to come.
The success of Sarah's discovery had ripple effects that extended far beyond her personal fortune. As news of the Morrison silver hoard spread through academic and collector communities, it sparked a renaissance of interest in Prohibition-era archaeology throughout the American West.
Dr. Patricia Hoffman approached Sarah with a proposal that would formalize and expand her research methods. The University of Montana, working with several other institutions, wanted to establish a research center dedicated to investigating hidden assets from America's criminal past. Sarah would serve as the center's director, combining her practical experience in treasure hunting with academic rigor in historical research. The proposed center would train researchers in the methods Sarah had developed: how to identify potential sites through genealogical research, property records, and criminal justice documents, how to use ground-penetrating radar and other technologies to locate hidden chambers, and how to properly excavate and document historical discoveries. Sarah was intrigued by the proposal, but cautious about committing to a full-time academic career. Her treasure hunting had been successful precisely because she'd maintained independence and flexibility. Joining a university structure might limit her ability to pursue promising leads or take calculated risks on uncertain discoveries. After months of negotiation, they reached a compromise. Sarah would establish the Morrison Center for Historical Investigation as an independent research institute affiliated with, but not controlled by the University of Montana. The center would be funded through a combination of private donations, grants, and revenue sharing from any discoveries made using the center's methods. The arrangement allowed Sarah to maintain her independence while providing academic legitimacy and resources for expanded research. The center would be headquartered at the Morrison Ranch, using the renovated facilities Sarah had created from her silver proceeds. The first major project undertaken by the Morrison Center was a comprehensive survey of Prohibition-era properties throughout Montana and Wyoming. Using Sarah's research methods, teams of graduate students and professional historians began identifying ranches, businesses, and residences that had been associated with bootlegging operations. The survey methodology was rigorous and systematic. Researchers started with federal law enforcement records from the 1920s and 1930s, identifying individuals and organizations that had been investigated for bootlegging activities. They then traced property ownership patterns, looking for real estate purchases that occurred during peak bootlegging years and featured characteristics similar to the Morrison Ranch. Properties that met initial screening criteria were subjected to more detailed investigation. Researchers examined building permits, tax records, and insurance documents to identify structures that might have been modified to include hidden storage areas. They interviewed older residents who might have family memories or local legends about Prohibition-era activities. The most promising sites were then examined using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies to detect potential hidden chambers or unusual structural features. Only sites that showed strong evidence of concealed spaces proceeded to actual excavation. The systematic approach yielded results within the first year. A ranch near Billings revealed a hidden chamber containing several $1,000s in 1920s currency that had been sealed in airtight containers. A former speakeasy in Helena yielded a collection of rare Canadian whiskey that had been walled up behind a false basement wall. While none of these discoveries approached the scale of Thomas Morrison's silver hoard, they validated Sarah's research methods and demonstrated that systematic investigation could reliably locate Prohibition-era caches. The success of the Morrison Center attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Federal Bureau of Investigation reached out to Sarah about consulting on cold cases involving missing assets from organized crime investigations. The FBI had dozens of cases dating back decades where criminal organizations were suspected of hiding substantial amounts of cash or valuables that had never been recovered. Sarah was initially reluctant to work with law enforcement, concerned it might compromise her academic independence or create conflicts with property owners who might have legitimate claims to discovered assets. But the FBI presented compelling arguments that her methods could help recover stolen property and resolve cases that had remained open for years. The collaboration began with a single consulting arrangement on a case involving a 1970s organized crime figure from Chicago who had purchased several properties in rural Montana shortly before his arrest on racketeering charges. The FBI suspected he had hidden significant assets on one of these properties, but traditional investigations had found nothing. Sarah's analysis of property records, construction permits, and the suspect's known associates led to the identification of a modified barn on a ranch near Great Falls. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies consistent with buried containers, and subsequent excavation recovered over $2 million in cash and gold coins that had been evidence in the original criminal case. The success of the FBI collaboration led to additional consulting requests from other law enforcement agencies. Sarah found herself working on cases involving missing assets from bank robberies, drug trafficking organizations, and white-collar crimes spanning several decades. The law enforcement work provided the Morrison Center with additional funding and credibility while expanding Sarah's understanding of how criminals had hidden assets across different eras. The methods that worked for Prohibition-era bootleggers proved applicable to more recent criminal cases, suggesting that asset concealment strategies had remained remarkably consistent over time. But the most significant development in Sarah's third year of operation was a discovery that eclipsed even Thomas Morrison's silver hoard. Acting on a tip from her FBI contacts, Sarah investigated a ranch in Wyoming that had been owned by a reputed mob associate during the 1950s and 1960s. The ranch had been purchased in 1952 by Vicente Torino, a Chicago businessman who had been investigated but never charged in connection with organized crime activities. Torino had spent substantial amounts on property improvements, including extensive work on the ranch's main barn that had required deep foundation excavation. Sarah's investigation of the Torino ranch would prove that Thomas Morrison's treasure was just the beginning of what remained hidden in the American West.
The Torino Ranch investigation began like Sarah's previous projects, with meticulous research into property records, construction permits, and the background of Vincent Torino himself. But as Sarah delved deeper into Torino's history, she realized she had stumbled onto something much larger than a single criminal's hidden assets. Vincent Torino hadn't been just another mob associate. FBI files, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed that he had been a key figure in a sophisticated money laundering operation that had moved millions of dollars from East Coast organized crime families to legitimate investments in Western real estate and businesses. The ranch in Wyoming had been purchased not as a retreat or hideout, but as a central hub for an operation that had used rural properties throughout the West to store and process illegal proceeds from gambling, narcotics, and labor racketeering activities. Sarah's research team discovered that Torino had purchased over a dozen properties across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado between 1952 and 1967. Each property had been subjected to extensive renovations that included unusual basement or foundation work, suggesting a systematic approach to creating concealed storage facilities. The Wyoming ranch showed the most promise for actual excavation. Property records indicated that Torino had spent over $200,000 on improvements in the 1950s, an enormous sum for ranch renovations at that time. Much of the money had gone to expanding and reinforcing the barn's foundation, work that had required permits for excavation to depths of 12 feet. When Sarah's team arrived at the ranch with ground-penetrating radar equipment, they found signatures consistent with multiple buried containers arranged in a grid pattern beneath the barn floor. The containers appeared to be larger than anything they had encountered in previous investigations, some measuring 6 feet by 8 feet and buried at depths of up to 10 feet. The current owners of the ranch, a retired couple who had purchased the property in the 1980s, were initially skeptical of Sarah's theories, but when she explained the potential historical significance of the discovery and offered to share any findings according to Montana treasure hunting laws, they agreed to allow limited excavation. The first container they located was a reinforced concrete vault that had been professionally installed and waterproofed,
When they finally broke through the concrete, Sarah found herself looking at the most sophisticated criminal asset storage facility she had ever encountered. The vault contained not just money and precious metals, but also documents, photographs, and records that provided an unprecedented window into organized crime operations of the 1950s and 1960s. There were detailed financial records showing how illegal proceeds had been moved through legitimate businesses, correspondence between crime family members discussing territorial disputes, and photographs of meetings between criminal figures who had never been officially connected by law enforcement. But the most shocking discovery was the cash itself. The vault contained over $12 million in currency from the 1950s and 1960s, much of it in sequential serial numbers that suggested it had been systematically skimmed from gambling operations or other illegal activities. The money was perfectly preserved, sealed in waterproof containers that had protected it from moisture and decay for over half a century. Some of the bills were so crisp, they appeared to have been printed recently, though the designs and serial number patterns clearly identified them as authentic vintage currency. Sarah immediately contacted her FBI liaisons about the discovery. The documents and records found in the vault could provide evidence for criminal cases that had remained unsolved for decades, while the cash itself might be recoverable assets from specific crimes. The FBI response was immediate and comprehensive. Special agents specializing in organized crime history flew to Wyoming to examine the discovery, bringing with them experts in document analysis and financial crimes investigation. What they found exceeded even the FBI's expectations. The Torino vault contained evidence linking East Coast crime families to Western criminal operations that law enforcement had suspected but never been able to prove. The financial records showed how millions of dollars in illegal proceeds had been laundered through legitimate businesses, creating paper trails that could potentially be used to recover additional hidden assets. Agent Patricia Morrison, no relation to Thomas Morrison, explained the significance of Sarah's discovery to the assembled team of researchers and law enforcement officials. This isn't just a treasure find. This is one of the most significant organized crime intelligence discoveries in FBI history. The documents in this vault could help us understand criminal networks that operated for decades without leaving traces in official investigations. The complexity of the discovery required careful coordination between Sarah's research team, FBI investigators, and federal prosecutors who would eventually determine how the evidence could be used in ongoing investigations. The cash alone presented legal challenges, determining whether it could be claimed by the government as proceeds of criminal activity or whether it belonged to the current property owners under state treasure hunting laws. Sarah found herself at the center of a legal and historical puzzle that was attracting attention from the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The discovery had implications not just for understanding organized crime history, but for active investigations into criminal organizations that might still be operating. The media attention surrounding the Torino discovery was more intense than anything Sarah had experienced with the Morrison silver. National news organizations picked up the story of the treasure hunter who's uncovering mob secrets, and Sarah found herself fielding interview requests from major television networks and national magazines. But the publicity also brought unwanted attention from less legitimate sources. Sarah began receiving anonymous phone calls warning her to stop investigating organized crime properties. Her research facility at the Morrison Ranch was broken into, though nothing was stolen. Federal marshals recommended that she accept protective security measures while the investigation of the Torino discovery continued. The discovery had transformed Sarah from an independent treasure hunter into a key figure in ongoing federal investigations of organized crime networks spanning multiple decades.
The protective security measures recommended by federal marshals turned Sarah's ranch headquarters into something resembling a small military installation. Professional security guards monitored the property around the clock. Sophisticated alarm systems were installed throughout the buildings, and Sarah found herself accompanied by armed escorts whenever she left the ranch for research activities. The security precautions proved justified when a team of unknown individuals attempted to break into the storage facility where the Torino discovery was being held for FBI analysis. The intruders were detected by motion sensors before they could access the building, but they escaped before security personnel could apprehend them. FBI analysis of the break-in attempt suggested it had been conducted by professionals with knowledge of security systems and law enforcement procedures. The sophistication of the attempt indicated that organized crime figures were taking Sarah's discoveries seriously enough to risk federal charges for interfering with an ongoing investigation. Agent Morrison explained the situation during a security briefing at the ranch. The documents you've uncovered contain information that could implicate people who are still alive and potentially still active in criminal organizations. Some of these individuals have resources and connections that make them genuinely dangerous. The threat assessment led to expansion of Sarah's security detail and restrictions on her public appearances. The FBI recommended that she suspend field investigations until the Torino case was fully processed and potential threats could be better evaluated. Sarah chafed under the security restrictions, but recognized their necessity. The discovery that had made her famous had also made her a target for people who had spent decades ensuring that certain secrets remained buried. During the enforced hiatus from fieldwork, Sarah focused on analyzing the massive amount of documentation recovered from the Torino vault. Working with FBI specialists and academic historians, she began mapping the connections revealed in the organized crime records. The documents showed that Vincent Torino's operation had been part of a much larger network of criminal asset management that had extended throughout the western United States. Crime families from Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia had used Western ranches and businesses not just to launder money, but to create long-term storage facilities for assets that needed to be hidden from law enforcement. The systematic nature of the network suggested that dozens of similar storage facilities might exist throughout the region, containing evidence and assets from organized crime operations spanning the 1940s through the 1980s. Sarah's research methods could potentially locate these sites, but each discovery would carry increasing risks as criminal organizations realized the scope of what she was uncovering. FBI investigators working with Sarah's team had begun following leads from the Torino documents to investigate other properties that might contain hidden assets. The investigation had expanded into a multi-state task force involving federal agencies, state law enforcement, and academic researchers. The task force's first major success came from a lead in the Torino papers indicating that a ranch near Denver had been used as a transfer point for moving assets between East Coast crime families and Western storage facilities. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed the presence of buried containers, and excavation revealed over $8 million in cash and precious metals dating from the 1960s. Each new discovery validated Sarah's research methods while expanding the scope of the investigation. The pattern was becoming clear. Organized crime figures had systematically used remote Western properties to create a network of hidden storage facilities that had operated undetected for decades. But success brought escalating security concerns. After the Denver discovery, Sarah received more direct threats, including a package containing photographs of her daily activities and a note suggesting that her research should be discontinued immediately. FBI analysis of the package indicated it had been prepared by professionals with access to surveillance equipment and detailed knowledge of Sarah's movements. The threat level prompted federal authorities to relocate Sarah to a secure facility while they assessed the scope of criminal interest in her work. For the first time since beginning her treasure hunting career, Sarah found herself in federal protective custody, unable to return to her ranch or continue her research activities. The protective custody arrangement was supposed to be temporary, but weeks stretched into months as FBI investigations revealed the extent of criminal interest in preventing further discoveries. Intercepted communications indicated that multiple criminal organizations were coordinating efforts to stop Sarah's research before more damaging evidence could be uncovered. The situation had evolved far beyond simple treasure hunting. Sarah had inadvertently uncovered evidence of criminal networks that were still active, and those networks were prepared to use violence to protect secrets that had remained hidden for decades. During her time in protective custody, Sarah worked with federal prosecutors to determine how her discoveries could be used in criminal prosecutions while protecting her safety and ensuring that any legitimate claims to recovered assets were properly handled. The legal complexities were staggering. The cash and precious metals she had discovered were clearly proceeds of criminal activity, but determining which specific crimes they represented required extensive investigation. Some of the evidence pointed to criminal activities that had occurred decades earlier, potentially beyond statute of limitations for prosecution. Meanwhile, property owners who had unknowingly purchased land containing hidden criminal assets faced their own legal challenges. Could they claim ownership of discovered treasure under state laws, or did the criminal origin of the assets give the federal government superior claims for forfeiture? Sarah's discoveries had created a legal precedent that would affect treasure hunting regulations, property rights, and organized crime prosecutions for years to come. Her research methods were being studied by law enforcement agencies worldwide, while her personal safety remained at risk from criminal organizations determined to prevent further discoveries. The treasure hunter who had started by researching her family's immigration history had become a key witness in one of the largest organized crime investigations in modern FBI history. But whether she would live to see the prosecution of the criminals whose secrets she had uncovered remained an open question.
6 months into protective custody, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the secure federal facility where she had been staying. Jake Morrison, the former SEAL commander who had sold her the ranch where everything began, had requested permission to meet with her to discuss a proposal that might resolve her security situation. Jake had been following Sarah's story through news reports and FBI briefings. His military security clearance had allowed him access to classified details about the investigation that weren't available to the general public. What he had learned convinced him that Sarah needed more than federal protection to survive the escalating threats from organized crime networks. "You've got 2 choices," Jake explained during their meeting in the facility's secure conference room. "You can stay in protective custody indefinitely while the FBI tries to prosecute criminals based on 50-year-old evidence, or you can disappear entirely and start over somewhere else." Sarah had been considering similar options during her months of confinement. The FBI had made progress in their investigations, but prosecuting organized crime figures based on decades-old evidence was proving more difficult than anticipated. Many of the criminals identified in the documents were dead, while others had legitimate legal defenses based on statutes of limitations and questions about evidence authenticity. Jake's proposal was more sophisticated than simple disappearance. Using his military contacts and experience with covert operations, he had developed a plan that would allow Sarah to continue her research while remaining invisible to criminal organizations seeking to stop her work. The plan involved creating a new identity for Sarah and establishing a covert research operation that would be officially affiliated with military intelligence services. Her treasure hunting methods had attracted attention from defense intelligence agencies interested in using similar techniques to locate hidden weapons caches and terrorist assets overseas. Working under military auspices would provide Sarah with security resources that exceeded what civilian law enforcement could offer, while her research would contribute to national security objectives that justified the protection costs. Sarah was intrigued but cautious about the proposal. Military service would mean giving up the independence that had made her treasure hunting successful, while subjecting her work to classification restrictions that might prevent her from publishing her discoveries or sharing her methods with academic researchers. Jake acknowledged the limitations, but argued that they were preferable to the alternatives. Remaining in protective custody indefinitely while the FBI tries to prosecute criminals based on 50-year-old evidence, or you can disappear entirely and start over somewhere else. "The people who want to stop your work aren't going to give up," he explained. "They've invested too much in keeping these secrets buried to quit now. Your only real choice is whether you want to keep fighting them with better resources or surrender everything you've built." After weeks of consideration, Sarah accepted Jake's proposal. The transition from civilian researcher to military contractor required extensive background investigations, security clearances, and training in operational security procedures that would protect her new identity. The new arrangement allowed Sarah to resume her research under military protection while contributing to intelligence operations that used her methods to locate hidden assets associated with terrorist organizations and foreign criminal networks.
Her first assignment involved investigating properties in the southwestern United States, where intelligence agencies suspected were being used to hide assets by drug trafficking organizations with connections to international terrorist groups. The work combined her expertise in treasure hunting with national security objectives that provided justification for military resources. The results exceeded expectations. Within 18 months, Sarah's research had led to the discovery of over $40 million in hidden assets associated with criminal organizations, while providing intelligence about smuggling routes and operational methods that proved valuable for ongoing law enforcement operations. The success of the military collaboration led to expansion of the program and assignment of additional researchers trained in Sarah's methods. What had begun as a solution to her personal security problems had evolved into a new capability for intelligence agencies worldwide. But Sarah never forgot the ranch in Montana where her treasure hunting career had begun. Working through intermediaries and security contractors, she arranged for the Morrison Ranch to be maintained as a research facility and museum, ensuring that Thomas Morrison's story and her discoveries would be preserved for future historians. The ranch continued to operate under the Morrison Center for Historical Investigation, with academic researchers using Sarah's methods to explore other aspects of American criminal history. The center became a model for similar institutions worldwide, demonstrating how systematic research could uncover hidden aspects of the past that traditional historical methods had missed. Jake Morrison remained involved as a security consultant for the center, ensuring that researchers could continue their work without facing the threats that had forced Sarah into protective custody. His military background and understanding of operational security proved invaluable for protecting academic researchers who were investigating sensitive historical topics. The collaboration between Sarah and Jake had transformed both of their lives in ways neither had anticipated when he first decided to sell his family's useless ranch. The property that had represented failure and disappointment for Jake had become the foundation for Sarah's career and ultimately led to innovations in both historical research and national security operations. 5 years after Sarah's initial discovery, the Morrison silver hoard had been completely sold and donated to museums, generating over $90 million that funded research centers and security operations worldwide. But the true value of the discovery wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the knowledge uncovered, the criminals prosecuted, and the methods developed that continued to reveal secrets that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep buried. The SEAL commander's decision to sell his ranch had set in motion events that changed historical research, organized crime prosecution, and intelligence gathering techniques across multiple agencies and institutions. Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are the ones that nobody expects to find.
10 years after Sarah Chen first walked through the basement of the Morrison Ranch, she stood in the same stone-walled chamber where Thomas Morrison's silver had waited nearly a century to be discovered. The room now served as a memorial display at the Morrison Center for Historical Investigation, with photographs and artifacts telling the story of how systematic research had uncovered one of America's greatest hidden treasures. Sarah's reflection on the decades since her discovery revealed a transformation that went far beyond personal wealth or professional success. The methods she had developed to find Thomas Morrison's silver had evolved into a new field of historical archaeology that was being taught at universities worldwide. Her techniques were being used not just to locate criminal assets, but to investigate missing artifacts from legitimate historical collections, locate lost Native American burial sites for proper repatriation, and even help military units overseas find hidden weapons caches left by retreating enemy forces. The financial impact of her discoveries had been extraordinary, but ultimately less important than their scientific and social contributions.
The $90 million from Thomas Morrison Silver had funded research centers, security operations, and educational programs that continued to generate new discoveries and train new researchers. The even larger sums recovered from organized crime storage facilities had been used by law enforcement agencies to compensate victims of criminal activity and fund crime prevention programs. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Sarah's work was the change it had brought to how historians and law enforcement agencies approached the investigation of hidden or lost assets. The systematic methodology she had developed, combining genealogical research, property record analysis, advanced technology, and careful excavation techniques, had become a standard protocol used by institutions ranging from university archaeology departments to international intelligence agencies. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, now director of the academic division of the Morrison Center, had documented over 300 successful applications of Sarah's methods worldwide. Researchers had used the techniques to locate everything from Viking treasure hoards in Scandinavia to Nazi gold caches in European forests to colonial-era pirate treasures in Caribbean coastal areas. Each successful application validated and refined the methodology, creating an ever-improving system for investigating historical mysteries that had previously seemed unsolvable. What Sarah had initially developed as a personal research project had become a global resource for understanding hidden aspects of human history. The law enforcement applications had been equally impressive. Federal agencies reported that techniques derived from Sarah's work had led to the recovery of over $2 billion in criminal assets, the resolution of hundreds of cold cases, and the disruption of criminal organizations that had operated undetected for decades. Jake Morrison had remained involved throughout the decade, transitioning from military contractor work to become the director of security operations for the Morrison Center. His experience with covert operations and understanding of criminal threats had proved invaluable as the center's work attracted attention from increasingly sophisticated adversaries. The security challenges had evolved along with the center's success. While the immediate threats from organized crime figures seeking to prevent discovery of their hidden assets had largely been resolved through prosecutions and protective operations, new challenges had emerged from international criminal organizations, foreign intelligence agencies, and even legitimate governments concerned about what historical investigations might reveal about past activities. The center now operated with security protocols that resembled those of major intelligence agencies, with classified research projects, secure communication systems, and international cooperation agreements that allowed Sarah's methods to be used in sensitive investigations worldwide. Despite the complexity and scope that her work had achieved, Sarah remained focused on the fundamental principles that had guided her initial investigation of the Morrison Ranch: careful research, systematic methodology, and respect for the historical significance of discoveries. The treasure hunting aspect of her work had evolved into something more resembling archaeology and historical investigation, but the core excitement of uncovering hidden secrets remained unchanged. Each new project brought the possibility of discoveries that could reshape understanding of historical events or reveal previously unknown aspects of human behavior. Sarah's most recent project involved investigating reports of hidden Confederate gold that had allegedly been buried in remote areas of the Southwest during the final days of the Civil War. Early research had identified several promising sites, and preliminary investigations suggested that systematic application of her methods might succeed where treasure hunters had failed for over 150 years. The project exemplified how Sarah's work had matured from individual treasure hunting to collaborative historical investigation. The Confederate gold research involved historians from multiple universities, archaeologists specializing in Civil War artifacts, federal agencies interested in recovering stolen government assets, and international experts in 19th century monetary systems.
As Sarah prepared to leave the memorial chamber where her career had essentially begun, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had started with genealogical curiosity about her family's immigration story and had led to innovations in fields ranging from historical research to national security operations. The transformation of her life had been dramatic, but so had the transformation of everyone connected to her discoveries. Jake Morrison had found new purpose in protecting researchers whose work contributed to historical understanding and criminal prosecution. Dr. Hoffman had established new academic programs that trained investigators in techniques that didn't exist a decade earlier. Even the current owners of properties where discoveries had been made had benefited from the historical significance and tourist interest that Sarah's work had brought to their communities. The Morrison Ranch itself had become a destination for researchers, students, and history enthusiasts from around the world. The property that Jake had considered a liability had been transformed into a valuable educational resource that generated revenue for the local community while preserving important historical information for future generations. As Sarah walked through the renovated ranch buildings that now house one of the world's most advanced historical investigation centers, she marveled at how dramatically circumstances could change based on research, persistence, and willingness to pursue unconventional ideas. The SEAL commander, who had sold his useless ranch, and the researcher who had bought it based on a theory about buried treasure, had both discovered that the most valuable treasures are often the ones that nobody expects to find. Thomas Morrison's silver was valuable, but the methods developed to find it had proven far more valuable than the treasure itself. 10 years after her first discovery, Sarah Chen continued to search for hidden secrets, knowing that somewhere in America's vast landscape, other treasures waited for researchers persistent enough to uncover the clues that would lead to their discovery. The work continued, and the possibilities remained endless. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.